And I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to where you're all joining from today and recognise First Nations people who are joining us tonight and acknowledge elders past and present. So if you could just spend the next couple of minutes just sharing what country you're joining us from tonight, that'll be welcome. And also just briefly when you're doing this acknowledgement, like a topic that will come up tonight is the income control program. Many of us know as income management, INJU, cashless welfare. Just to note that was extended in the budget, a program that was designed and targeted specifically at First Nations communities in the Northern Territory and Northern Queensland. This is a prime example of the welfare system and how it is weaponised against Indigenous peoples in the colony. But I won't give away too much because we'll obviously get to that later on in the panel. So just a few things for housekeeping tonight. First of all is we will have questions at the end of the night. So just put them in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it and be taking notes and passing them on. So if you can just pop them in the chat and I'll keep a note on that. Second of all is if you require me for anything to, let me know if you're having any tech issues where I might be able to help or you're being harassed or annoyed in the chat, you can directly message me where it won't be visible to other people. So just take a note of my name just down the bottom. It should be down there somewhere. And you can just send me a direct message. You're also able to do that for questions too. And if you find, because there might be some knocking or dinging from thumbs up and so forth throughout the night, you can change your notifications down the bottom. So if you just move your mouse, there will be a settings panel which you can click and you're able to go into the notifications section and turn it off there. And finally, just before we get things kicked off, I just no dickheads. Pretty simple. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if there's any misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, racism, any of that, I will kick you out. It's pretty simple. Let's just be respectful and recognize that we're all punching bags. And even though some of us may look different to one another, we all do have a lot of things in common at the end of the day. So let's just try be nice. I'm sure we will. It'll be fine. Anyway, now, finally, I will be handing over to the wonderful Amy Remeikis, who will be hosting the panel tonight and is joining us from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. I'm sure you all know Amy and her work with The Guardian and now with a political analyst with the Australia Institute and a writer for The Point and The New Daily. But we'll also be hearing from Chels from How's You. How's You is a grassroots housing justice organisation based on unceded Bundjalung country in Northern Rivers, New South Wales. They believe that housing is a human right, not a wealth vehicle. Homes are for living in, not hoarding for profit. So they're organising for the systemic change required so that everybody gets a house, starting with the bare minimum, ending unfair property investor tax breaks and investing in housing first. Then we'll hear from Kristin O'Connell, who is with co-coordinator at the Anti-Poverty Centre. Kristin, for those who don't know Kristin, is a DIS recipient and DSP recipient. And she'll be chatting tonight about the state of the NDIS, the embattled employment services system, and also the fact that this budget had nothing for people on no and low incomes. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Maiy, Azize and Isabelle Truong, who will be discussing Angus Taylor's pretty revolting budget reply, revolting and lazy, and that sought to demonize migrants and welfare recipients in one go. So Isabelle is a contributor at the Anti-Poverty Centre and is joining us from Bidjigal country, and Maiy is a member of the Anti-Poverty Centre and Deputy Director at Anglicare Australia, who is joining us from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Amy. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that, Jay, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight. I know it's a big ask given the state of the world and just everything that's happening at the moment, to also give up your time. So thank you so much for that, and I hope that we can answer some of your questions tonight that you may have. I'm just going to give like the brief political overview of the budget, and I'll be speaking as a member of the press gallery, but also someone whose job it is to analyse both politics and political media. So the government, as I'm sure many of you would be well aware, have spent the last few years manufacturing consent to cut the NDIS. And the way that they did that was they started a few years ago when Bill Shorten was still the minister, and they started leaking out or dropping out stories about how the NDIS funds were being misused. And they categorized misuse by things that they found in the tribunals, like challenges that may have been taken to the AAT, but also just cases where providers had basically misused some funds and used that to blame recipients for it. They also deliberately misconstrued how recipients use the NDIS. So companions or people to assist with social outings were basically diminished to just movie tickets or movie outings. They didn't go into any of the context or the reasons as to why some of these events are covered by the NDIS. They basically just try to organize as much anger as possible. So it was not a surprise to anyone who was watching that to see Mark Butler a couple of weeks before the budget come out and say that we are now going to cap funding to the NDIS. What was interesting about that from my perspective was that just the week or two before, the government had completely ruled out any changes to fossil fuel subsidies. And the reason that that is interesting is because fossil fuel subsidy growth is actually outstripping the funding growth of the NDIS. So in the last financial year, Australia state and federal governments provided $16.3 billion in subsidies to fossil fuel producers, which is a year-on-year increase of over 10% or so, which is outstripping the NDIS growth, which was only 7.6% over the same period. Most of that money goes to the mining companies. The government likes to tell people that it's for agriculture and for farming, particularly when it comes to the biggest part of that, which is the fuel tax subsidy. So anybody who puts fuel in their car usually pays an excise to the government. Fossil fuel companies do not pay that. They get it refunded to them. They just basically put in a bill. And BHP is the biggest user of fuel in Australia. So the government has basically said, no, we're not touching any of the fossil fuel subsidies, but what we are going to do is start limiting the growth of the NDIS. And they were able to do that, as I said, because they had spent so long laying the groundwork within the wider community to cut the NDIS. And that resulted when the announcement was made of most of the press gallery, and the press gallery is the group of journalists who cover federal politics. Most of the press gallery reacted that this was a very brave reform, that this was a very necessary reform, that this was something that showed that Labor was serious about the economy, and there was almost no time or effort put into explaining what this would actually mean for people. And obviously there are a lot of issues in terms of what it means for people with existing plans as well as future plans. But one of the biggest issues that has come out of the budget as well, because it was not in there, is what is going to replace a lot of the services and supports that are currently provided by the NDIS, which will not be provided anymore. The states, they don't know. But the government is just saying, we're going to move you across to the states for a lot of those early interventions, and good luck with that. The budget was a real story about choices. Governments always have choices about how they spend their money. This choice was to cut the NDIS while increasing defense spending, while maintaining fossil fuel subsidies, and basically while restricting any sort of social services funding at all. So while structurally the tax reform around CGT and negative gearing is not a bad thing. It's a very overdue measure to start restructuring our tax system. There was, in terms of what it did socially for the social contract and social services, it is maybe the most devastating budget in modern political memory. As some of the other speakers will talk about, there's nothing for social housing in there. There is nothing in terms of supports for low and medium income earners. There is no raise to welfare benefits. There is no social housing. There is no increased services for people who may need some extra help, but there is extra funding for the government to start providing defences against people who may start taking their cases to tribunals. So the government is literally preparing to fight challenges to their rule changes in the tribunals and in the courts. The other part of the budget story that hasn't, largely been told, apart from, and Kristin will get into this, the actual broken promise, which is to completely get rid of the Indue card or the basics card, which they have extended in this budget, is that the reason that there is almost a hysterical response to what are quite modest, overdue tax structural changes that are not actually going to change the ground for many people who already take advantage of those tax settings. The reason why we've seen such a hysterical response to that and to the changes to trusts is because there is no political opposition to what they are doing in terms of the NDIS and the social spending. The Greens are fighting against it, but they don't hold balance of power in this particular government unless the government goes to them. And the government often does not go to them. They often find some way to find consensus with the Liberal Party, which has been, systematically rejected by the Australian voters for 2 elections in a row now, when the government has trouble because the government does not want to compromise any further than what it has done. Labor does not like to move on that. So if the Greens or independents like David Pocock were going to make the move on that, they just shift it to the coalition to pass things. And the coalition do not disagree on the NDIS cuts. They do not disagree with the lack of help and support for people on low incomes and on welfare. There is political unity for that, and that is thought of as being particularly rational and reasonable by most of Australia's press. It is only when people start to go, this is actually going to impact me or a loved one or a family member or my neighbour, that they start clocking on to the fact that this is actually quite an unfair budget. But by then it'll be too late. So I will move on to some of our other speakers who can go more into depth about what is actually in the budget and how it's going to work. But my overview is that, structurally, the tax changes are sound. Overall, though, very devastating, particularly since the budget papers show that we are moving towards 5% inflation, which is particularly scary for anybody on a low income, but even more scary in this particular context because there is a risk of what they call stagflation. The last time stagflation hit was in the 1970s, again because of a manufactured oil crisis. And what stagflation is when you have high unemployment, high inflation, and low to no growth in the economy. And the reason that is a problem for people who pay attention to these things is that usually to deal with inflation, the Reserve Bank and the government just tweak the settings to make more people unemployed. So we are facing a period where the government and the RBA will be working towards making more Australians unemployed in order for them to be able to combat inflation while they're doing absolutely nothing for the people who literally are paying the price for Team Australia. And that is probably not something that has received a lot of attention, and there's, you know, lots of other big ticking time bombs in that budget, but that's probably for another discussion. So I will now move on to Chels, who can start telling you a little bit about how disastrous this budget is in terms of housing in the material sense.
Thanks so much, Amy. Yes, my name's Chels. I'm organising with House You. We want to get everybody a house, and I'm sure lots of people on this call would also love to do that. Look, this budget did not hit the bare minimum. It absolutely has tinkered around the edges, but I will start with, what did the budget get right? We have wound back the Howard era 50% capital gains tax discount, and that wasn't one from politicians changing their mind, thinking that they'll do something with the good of their heart. That was one because we actually fought. People like you and me, renters, actually got really noisy ahead of this budget, and obviously for years before. We are at breaking point. People cannot afford their rent. People cannot afford their mortgages. We're paying through the teeth, and we aren't actually able to even secure housing. So Australia has an obscene obsession with housing as an investment, which has ultimately led to this crisis. I mean, not many countries are in this world of pain in terms of housing. The point of taxes is actually to distribute that money to provide services, public infrastructure, things like public housing, so that our lives can be made better. What this government did with this budget was, yes, it removed the 50% capital gains tax discount, but what did we see for negative gearing? We've seen grandfathering. That is not bold, and that is not reform. It is protecting every existing investor who is already hoarding homes, who are squeezing working people tighter and tighter with higher and higher rents. They will continue to benefit from this negative gearing and from these tax concessions. It's essentially a get out of jail free card for the house hoarders who have created this rigged game and who are highly profiting off us just needing a basic human right such as shelter. So another thing that we've seen is this youth allowance concession for the Commonwealth rent assistance. This is giving an increase to the rent assistance for people who are on Oz Study and AB Study and the youth allowance. This is essentially public money going back into the hands of privatised housing. This is not actually building new public homes. This is just taking public money and putting it into the hands of community housing providers. These people were actually, unfortunately, discriminating against young people because their incomes were so low when they were on these payments. So they would choose people with high incomes, and they were essentially picking based on who could pay them more and how much money they could make. So if we had public housing, that wouldn't be happening. We would have beautiful publicly owned homes at scale that would provide everybody a house, no matter how much money you made. So what did this budget fail to deliver? Public housing. It is a no-brainer. We haven't had a single mention of public housing in this budget. It happens year after year. I was looking at some of our old stories, and we said the same thing a few years ago. This government and previous governments have literally wiped their hands of the essential service that is public housing. Every other measure has tinkered around the edges, which is trying to fix a market that's already failed. We've had, 25 years of these tax breaks, which essentially was introduced to increase supply and, the market will deliver. Look, we've got the proof is in the pudding. We've had 25 years of these tax breaks. They haven't delivered. Investors are not only not creating the stock, but they're just buying and selling houses, which is inflating house prices, which is why everything is so unaffordable. So what we needed to see was our tax dollars, our collective wealth that we're all contributing to give us the fundamental human rights that we're all entitled to. And what is lacking is still the political will. So I guess, where do we go from here? We all need to campaign loud and proud that we want public housing. We want our taxes to be funding public services, universal healthcare, and everybody needs a fair go. So unfortunately, this budget did choose to maintain a sick status quo, but we won't stop organising until everybody gets a house.
Thank you so much for that, Chels. I'll also say the other thing that was missing in this budget was a gas tax, which could bring an extra $17 billion into the budget, where the government would find suddenly that it could make a lot more different choices and things, but they're deliberately choosing not to make that choice. For how long, I think, really depends on the public mood. Also moved now, I think, to it's Kristin who's going to be speaking next, who will be talking more about the impact on welfare and the Indue card and all of the other terribleness in the budget.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy, and Chels and everyone else who is speaking. Can someone give me a nod if I can be heard? We've just been having some internet troubles. Cool, great, thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you, Amy, for noting at the beginning that this is a very unpleasant and difficult time, and for people to bring their energy to come to this event is really wonderful, and we're very grateful to have you here with us. Last week, myself and Chels were at Parliament, and it's a pretty awful place to be at any time, especially on budget night, as we were waiting to try and get the media to hear what we had to say about our communities. We were watching workers bringing in bottles of wine and champagne into the rooms where everyone had been in lockup, obviously to congratulate themselves for whatever victories they saw for themselves in this budget, and without presumably any thought given to those of us whose lives are either going to get a lot worse or just a little bit worse if we're lucky. Amy's already touched on the NDIS changes, and I know that's very scary for everyone who is affected by it, who's here right now. I know that there is currently an inquiry going on, and at the moment the legislation the government has released, which they are trying to rush through Parliament really quickly, is subject to an inquiry, which I believe the Greens secured. So you can make a submission to that if you either are someone with a disability who would like to be accessing disability supports and aren't currently through the NDIS, or if you are on the NDIS and are concerned or confused or fearful about the support that you're going to lose, there is an opportunity to make a submission. We know at the Anti-Poverty Centre, we always want people to understand that making a submission, unfortunately, even though it doesn't dictate what governments do. If you want your views on record and your experiences on record, when we put those submissions in, we are creating a historical record, and we are making sure that there cannot be any truthful denial that they knew what was going to happen. So I think if Jay hasn't shared it already, I'll drop something in the chat in a minute. There'll be an event tonight on TikTok for people who are on TikTok to just do a kind of a submission working bee. In terms of the things that actually the other things that haven't gotten much attention, we did have that really firm commitment, a really unequivocal commitment from the Labor Party in 2022 to abolish all forms of income control. If you're not sure about what income control is, it's primarily targeting First Nations people, and it has seen the increase in or really horrible health outcomes for newborn babies, in addition to a lot of people being trapped in really harmful situations, violent situations, or just experiencing shame when they're going to try and buy things that they need because there is a specific poor person branded welfare card that they have to use, or being price gouged by stores that know their shopping choices are limited. So this has been locked in this budget at least for another 4 years. One of the earliest things that Labor did when they came to government was to extend the program that they had committed to abolish and rebranding it. Everybody knows, I think, who's on a welfare payment, that there is no increase for us. There is nothing coming in terms of financial relief in this budget. But I do just want to highlight some very small things that have maybe been lost in the detail. So we do have I think, as Amy touched on, structural unemployment, things like the Reserve Bank of Australia targeting a specific number of unemployed people, which means that many of us are locked out of work, usually discriminated against because we're carers or disabled, or because of our race. And that isn't going to change. But we are concerned about a forecast in the budget to see a reduction in the amount that the government spends on the job seeker payment. We have been asking around about what that means. At the moment, nobody is sure. So we are going to have federal budget estimates coming up in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully we'll be keeping an eye on questions to the department then about what the government has included in those figures, what Treasury is seeing as a reason that spending might go down on unemployment payments, when unemployment payment rates will go up with indexation in line with inflation, and the number of people who need to access those payments is expected to increase. There's a couple, I know I'm almost out of time, but there's just two more things I really want to flag before we move on and hopefully get to cover more in the conversation. There has been a change, a very, very, very tiny change, and I'm calling it the work will set us free change, because not only has the government's rhetoric about this budget been workers deserve support and no one else, their very narrow definition of workers, but there is a change to carer payment restrictions, meaning that if you have a cap of hours you can work if you're on the carer payment of 100 hours per month, and they will no longer count the travel time to a job if you have one, and they won't count study. And what that means, of course, is that carers are now allowed to care full time for the person they need to care for, do paid work, travel to that paid work, and study, and somehow sleep as well, instead of, I guess, a payment that they could afford to live on. The National Press Club, there will be an address from the Employment Minister coming up next week. Jay will drop a link to that in the chat, and we'll be sharing information about it. But there's very little in the budget in terms of what the government plans. So we're expecting to hear more then. But we do have in that budget document a flag that there is $600 million unspent in the employment fund. So if you do have compliance requirements and you have a job agency and you need them to pay for something, whether that's phone credit, fuel, taxi, work boots, whatever it is, and they tell you they don't have any money, make sure that you either lodge a complaint on the National Customer Service line, which also received a little bit of funding, or get in touch with us, and I'll drop an email address in the chat for that as well. We'll come back to more things later. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. We now have Isabelle and Maiy, who are going to be doing a joint discussion on some of the other issues in the budget, including the budget in reply speech that Angus Taylor gave 2 days after the budget was delivered, which is essentially just a callback to Australia having a discriminatory migration program, as well as was previously mentioned, demonising welfare recipients and migrants in one red hot go. So thank you.
Hi folks, my name's Isabelle. I am a carer and I also work at the Anti-Poverty Centre, and I'm calling in from Bidjigal country today. I think my first point, sorry if I'm looking on the other screen, I've just got some notes here. My first impression of Angus Taylor's budget reply is that it's firstly much of a muchness about the same sorts of themes that the coalition has always built their brand on, and also most of the key things that they have brought up are things that have bipartisan support and have consistently been supported by Labor policy and Labor while they were in government. So I'll briefly cover three things, which is the government debt too high narrative, the abhorrent stuff on migration and welfare in the one go, and the same old tired story about net zero. So my first response to Angus Taylor's stuff about welfare and migrants was just that it's so unpleasant and it's so frustrating and it's so upsetting, but it's also incredibly, incredibly boring. This is a country that is full of smart people and really smart ideas. And there are so many different things that we could be doing, as Chels and Amy and Kristin have kind of covered, that would address housing, people's welfare, people's safety. And time again, we come back to this same idea, which is migrants bad, dole bludgers bad, welfare bad. And it's just really frustrating. It's actually kind of, I got to hand it to Angus Taylor. Like I was surprised by how boring and also violent and upsetting this sort of rhetoric is, because it's just such a tired trope. The response from Labor and broader progressives is also incredibly frustrating. It's well-meaning. There's a constant emphasis on, well, no, actually, migrants contribute loads, and welfare recipients contribute loads. And, you know, that's true. Payments that non-citizens are on is really minimal, and skilled migrants do contribute a lot in terms of tax and in terms of productivity in the economy, if that's something that you particularly care about. And I could sit here and tell you the dollar amount that like investing in, social spending gives back to the economy if you give $1 to a poor person, blah, blah, blah. But I'm just really tired of that. I'm really, really, really exhausted by this constant justification, this constant performance that migrants and poor people have to do to make themselves small and say, hey, actually, we don't take up space at all. Please don't hate us. That's really tiring. Yeah, it is really exhausting. I know that assimilation to this country has caused this sort of, in the people that I know, has caused this sort of insane mental gymnastics rationalization where they have to try and, in order to feel like they have a place here and that they have the capacity to build a world here, away from, often not by choice as well, away from the place that they were born, they have to accept crumbs and they constantly have to perform gratitude. And when Taylor first gave his budget reply, I just thought, I'm kind of almost embarrassed for them, from people like, you know, in my family, like my mum, because they've done all this work to contort themselves into this tiny, tiny thing that's constantly grateful and constantly says, you know, I'm so lucky to be here and I'm so thankful that this country accepted me. And all for what? When this country goes, you know, when the going gets tough and we come up against the product of our own intentional, deliberate policy failures, who are the scapegoats? What are the solutions that we bring up? That migrants are bad and dole bludgers are bad and welfare is bad. And I just think it's such a waste because, you know, these people that I love and that I care about have done all this work and there's nothing really to show for it. This country does not, your place in this country is conditional. Of course, like, you know, the elephant in the room is that obviously Taylor he has like a sub-zero chance of forming government. And the specific details of, you know, the migration policy, the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, and these are the 17 payments that they're not going to get access to. It's not really hugely relevant. I think it's more that the narrative and the what it primes voters to do is to say welfare bad and migrants bad. And not even migrants bad, but non-white people bad, because really that's what he's conjuring up when he talks about migrants and non-citizens. He's not really talking about white people. He is talking about people from the global south, people with an accent. Yes, so that's my sort of incoherent rambling, but that's my kind of response to his migration and welfare policy. And just briefly, Angus Taylor brought up the fact that government debt is too high and that government spending has blown out of proportion. This is stuff that they've been trading on for decades. It's not new, but I just noted that he used the COVID pandemic period as an example of how terrible government spending is and how terrible it is that people rely on the government, when for many people, that is the first time that the income supplement payment has ever been above the poverty line or has ever met that. I know that people were sharing stories about, this is the first time that I could buy fresh fruit and vegetables regularly. I was no longer ill. I could afford my medications. I just think there's such a huge disconnect there between the lived experience of what we know it's like and what politicians think in Canberra. And finally, I just wanted to briefly touch on net zero. Taylor has very predictably pledged to roll back net zero obligations. And firstly, I think that ignores the fact that climate change is going to continue to happen and make life more expensive for us. And the longer we rely on fossil fuels to fund our lives and to build our lives, will increase costs that the government has to spend on looking after us. And also, the narrative work that he's done there is to say that actually it's renewable energy that's pushing up the costs of your energy prices. We actually are working on a little campaign about why that's not true and why renewables actually are good, and why it's actually for-profit energy retailers who are acting in ways that are kind of unfair and not equitable to increase costs for people. So I think Jay will put a little link. If anyone has any dodgy retailer behaviour that they've experienced, if they're in energy debt, if they are just gobsmacked by how much their energy is costing and they can't afford it, please visit the link. We really want to hear from you. And yeah, I'll hand over to Maiy now.
Thanks, Isabelle. I'm not sure if you've been watching the screen, but lots of people have been reacting, clapping, heart emoji, also angry emoji in response to everything you've been saying. So thanks for everything you've said. But I do also want to say thanks to Kristin and the Anti-Poverty Centre for being willing so quickly to come out and condemn what was in the budget reply so quickly. I have had a bit of a concern that there's been a treatment of the budget reply as though it's a real speech, and treating the announcements in it, especially things like indexing tax brackets, as though they're actual announcements in a normal, sane, sensible budget reply. I was particularly disappointed with the Michelle Grattan piece that came out the next day that said, that the budget reply was a mix of sound policy and, bad rhetoric or something. It's really missing the point about why that was a significant budget reply, and I think really missed the mark in terms of how we all need to be responding to it. And I really hope that more people get their act together to respond more firmly in response to all of the stuff that I'm sure we're all about to be seeing quite a bit more of in the next couple of years. There's a couple of things I want to say about the budget reply. And the first is that it reframes the housing crisis and the inequality crisis as being problems that have been imported into Australia from overseas, as opposed to problems that have been substantially created by politicians like Angus Taylor. So Australia used to have affordable homes to buy and to rent, and I should say I totally echo everything that Chels said earlier. We used to have affordable homes in Australia to buy and to rent because the government was a very big supplier of housing in Australia. 1 in 3 renters used to rent from the government. 1 in 4 new builds in Australia used to be built by the government. That was at the high point of building. In the 80s and 90s, the federal government really stepped back from providing housing. And in the past couple of decades, as Chels was telling us before, the government now spends or loses in the budget every year between $15 and $20 billion on subsidies for market housing. It spends about $2 billion on actually providing housing themselves. So if you want to understand why we're in a housing crisis, that's why we're in a housing crisis. It's not because of a problem that's been imported overseas. It's because the government isn't doing the job that it should be doing, which is providing homes to the people who live in this country in the way that it used to do. And instead, it's been spending billions of dollars on things that push up the cost of housing and make housing more unfair. In his speech, Angus Taylor said, we need to let the housing market catch up. And we've actually been focusing on housing supply, private housing supply in Australia for decades now. Over the past decade, Australia's built 1 million new homes, and that totally outstrips population growth and outstrips immigration. And in fact, we've never had more homes per person than we have now. So this prescription is really about doing more of the same of what we're currently doing and hoping that it works differently, or that it creates a different or fairer result. And we all know that government has created the inequality crisis for all of the reasons that Kristin and Amy were both talking about before, by systematically defunding and or failing to properly fund incomes. You know, we know how to pull people out of poverty, and it's by raising their incomes, and government is choosing not to do that. The other thing I really want to touch on is the fact that the coalition's rhetoric around immigration, while it's really ugly and really dangerous, the way for that rhetoric has actually been paved by this government, and also by quite a lot of public commentary as well. I shouldn't ignore that, especially in housing, with the focus on demand and supply. When you reduce housing to demand and supply, and when you talk about homes as though they're just bananas, it's all about, numbers, demand and supply. That does pave the way for people to see human beings, other human beings who come into the country and need homes, not just immigrants, really, anybody who needs housing is kind of part of a quote unquote problem. And when you talk about services like the NDIS, in terms of scarcity and there being too much demand for them, that also paves the way for people who need to access those services wherever they come from, being viewed as a problem. So I think all of that scarcity rhetoric, all of that demand and supply rhetoric does pave the way for people to be susceptible, I think, to the rhetoric around immigration. I should say the government has been doing a lot of that, but I really do want to say, a lot of really mainstream, very normie political commentators also buy into that there's a problem with the NDIS, that it's expensive or difficult to raise the rate of job seeker somehow. And lots of people, some of the smartest people I know, genuinely believe that Australia has a shortfall in the number of homes that we've got, even though we've never had more homes per person than we've ever had. So all of that paves the way. And I think in terms of how the kind of social sector has paved the way for this, and this is something Kristin has heard me speak about before, when people talk about any problem, in this case I am going to focus on housing again, but really any problem, as though it doesn't have a cause, so housing is really expensive, and you tell that story in a way where there's no villain in the story. I think it does, again, create an opening for someone who does have a villain, someone who tells that story in a way where there is a villain in it, to really gain traction. I've thought for a long time that the simplest, the best and the most effective thing that housing advocates can do to counter the immigration rhetoric when it comes to housing is to tell a version of the story that has a villain in it. This was a crisis that's been created by government and developers. And I think that is a story that people are very open to believing. Right now, they hear a whole lot of fluff and white noise about how housing is really expensive. It's a story that has... sometimes the construction of that story doesn't even have an actor in it, much less a villain. And when you tell a story that way, it follows that if there's no person causing it, there's no obvious solution. And when someone comes along and tells them a story that lines up with other changes they might be seeing in society, I think they're much more likely to believe it, because people who are blaming immigrants aren't just telling the better story, they're actually telling the only story, the only really complete story. And the last thing I want to say before I wrap up is that we're going to see more of this, and it's going to land a lot more than it's landing, because I have a real fear that the government talks up a lot of the things that it does. It loves to describe the actions that it's taking as ambitious. And I'm a very strong supporter of the tax changes that the government has made in this budget, but I do worry that overstating the impact that this will have, talking about these as kind of generation-defining reforms. The government did this with the Housing Australia Future Fund just a couple of years ago. And I think when people hear politicians say that the government is doing something and it's going to make this really big impact, and they hear this again and again, they really lose confidence in the idea that government can actually do anything to fix problems. And it becomes, I think, a lot easier for people to believe that the problem is something that's been imported from outside. If you hear all this messaging from government and also supporters of government in the media saying the government is doing, actually, this Housing Australia Future Fund, it really is going to deliver all these homes, and people don't know the details or, the exact numbers or what they mean. And you hear all these people kind of stepping in and saying, yes, tax, that's, these tax changes really are going to fix housing inequality. And then 5 or 10 years later, people can't feel the impact of that in their own lives. I think it's creating a massive, massive problem. And I think we, unfortunately, I wish I could end on a cheerier note, but I do think we are likely to see more of this rhetoric in the next few years.
Yes, thank you, Maiy. I think depressingly, you are absolutely right. I will just add to the comments on Angus Taylor's speech. Literally none of it was new, including his idea to index inflation to income tax brackets. That was something that Malcolm Fraser's government flirted with in the late 1970s and had in place for about 2.3 seconds, and then had to wind back and then scrap altogether by about 1981, which was only 3 years after they first announced it, because it was so expensive and it was running out of control in terms of the cost to the budget that John Howard, who was treasurer at the time, basically had to walk away one of his first promises, and that's where he got the nickname Honest John from. So there is nothing new under the sun when it comes to anything that they're doing in the budget or the budget reply. It's not a particularly cheery conversation. It is quite a heavy one, and it is one that can leave people feeling, I think, quite hopeless. And I don't think any of us want to leave anybody feeling without hope, because that's also not true. It's really difficult and tough, but we're also in such an inflection point with everything that is happening domestically in Australia and politics, that there is actually quite a lot of room to focus that anger and despair and rage and sort of force people into doing things that they wouldn't necessarily be forced into. An example of that, and while it is not life-changing, the government didn't actually want to do the CGT or negative gearing changes until the next election. They wanted to take it as part of their election platform. That is what they'd been building towards. And they decided in the last couple of weeks leading up to the budget to do the changes, and that was literally just because anger had reached such a fever pitch around housing in Australia that if they did not have something, that they would be spending the next year and a half of their term basically fighting the public into trying to convince them that they're doing something. So it reached a point where they could not wait as long as they opportunity to push them in that direction in all sorts of things, because inequality in Australia is rising. It's already at historical highs, but it is getting wider and wider in terms of the gap. So I'm going to start, I think, with Chels, who is there, even though that you can't see them because obviously there's some internet issues going on for a lot of us at the moment. But Chels, what would you have done in the budget? What would be the number one thing that you would have done? And what is something that you can tell people to do?
Chels, I've just asked your your mic to unmute. I'm not sure if you got a little notification about that. We
may have lost Chels. Possibly. Okay, I'll go to Maiy then. Maiy, what would you have done in the budget, and what is something people can do to feel like they can make a change and take back some control?
I think the biggest thing would be a really, really big spend on housing, like an actual. I mean, I feel like this is one of those things where actual human individuals, when you ask them what should the government do to make housing more affordable, they've got a really clear sense of it. The government just needs to build homes that people can afford to live in. And, you know, political commentators love to make that really complicated. You know, we need to do something with zoning rules to make it easier for developers to build, you know, like these really, really indirect things. We need some elaborate off-budget mechanism to raise money, because the government couldn't possibly just put money into housing directly itself.
Not helped at all by the fact that most of Canberra is obsessed with that stupid abundance book.
Oh God,
yes. Tape that everything is going to be just fine.
Yeah, and that's a really convenient frame for them, this idea that local neighbourhood groups are actually more powerful than the government, and actually they're the ones that are causing Australia's housing crisis, and that's the reason that no affordable homes can get built, is insane. But it's a narrative that really works for government, because in that version of the story, all they need to do is make it possible for the private sector to build more homes, and then the federal government can just blame other levels of government when that doesn't happen. So I would say just put a bunch of money into building homes that people can afford. I was getting the message to wrap up when I did have actually one other thing to say about the budget reply, but we do live in an upside down universe at the moment, where the federal government pretends to spend a lot of money on housing. You know, it bandies around a lot of fake numbers. It says it's spending $45 billion. You know, most of that is loans and off-budget measures. And then in the budget reply, Angus Taylor promised to cut that. And it does feel like we're living in the upside down, when the federal government is pretending to spend money on housing, and then the opposition is pretending to cut the money that the government isn't spending on housing. So that's all a bit silly. But a useful thing that people can do, it's something the Anti-Poverty Centre is already doing, but I think make sure that when you're talking about housing to anyone in your life, you know, any of your neighbours, any of your friends, any of your colleagues, say who caused the housing crisis. I think that's even more important than saying immigrants didn't cause the housing crisis. I think simply telling a story that has a villain in it, that people will believe, that happens to be true, but it's believable to people, and it lines up with their actual life experience and changes that they can see. I think that's the most powerful thing that people can do.
And Chels, yay, you're back. Thank you. What is something that people can do? Like, what is to kind of not just shift the narrative, but shift power in this situation?
Well, firstly, if I had control over our money, the budget, first thing I would do is ask everyday people what they want to spend their money on. And I guarantee you, we would be funding everything that we need. If you look at Finland, they have literally housed their population. There is a housing first policy out there that Australia could implement tomorrow. It centres housing as a human right and then wraps support around the people so that they can stay housed. That is a no-brainer. But yes, if we are to just build power collectively, I think we should be taking more direct action. We are powerful because we actually are the majority. We are the working class. We're the ones that literally run this society, and it's only those people on top who are benefiting from our hard work. So if you would like to do some fun collective action, you should definitely get involved with How's You. We'd love to squat the lot. We want to take back power. I mean, the houses exist whether an investor owns them or not. And I really think that that's where Australia needs to go. We need collective bargaining against landlords so that tenants have rights. And we really need to maybe look at mortgage and rent strikes. So yeah, please hit up How's You. We would love to work with you.
And Chels also has some information on why build to rent is so terrible. So if anyone has any queries about that, also please get in touch with House You. And Isabelle and Kristin, what can people do? What action can they take? Where can they find community and a little bit more pushback against the monolith that is the agreeable politics we have at the moment?
Isabelle, did you want to talk a little bit briefly about the energy debt stuff? And I'm going to grab the link to the template letter to waive energy debts.
Yeah, my answer to that question is to get involved in things, to talk to people about things. Don't sit in your house alone and let your heart just break, because that's what I think it so often feels like. Why am I getting emotional? Sorry. But yes, on that note, we are running a campaign called Stop the Bill Shock, which I spoke about briefly. And we're asking people to write to their MPs. It doesn't have to be official. It doesn't have to be long and lengthy. It can just be, fuck you, my energy is too expensive. What are you going to do about it? Press send. That's literally all it needs to be. Yeah, we have a website where you can read through. We've got a report which looks at the cost of electricity and for-profit energy retailers and poor behaviour in that space. So yeah, it's just get involved, talk to people about it. That's my answer.
Thanks, Isabelle. We do have a template as well for people to write to their energy company requesting a waiver of their energy debt. And I cannot find the link to that right now. So Jay will be sending out an email to everyone who's signed up to this event in the morning, and we'll include that. We also have a template to help people request their records from Centrelink or their job agency or both, going back for as long as you have been connected to the welfare system. And we've been supporting people to do that over the past year and uncovered a lot of very interesting information. And as we extremely briefly touched on earlier tonight, there is a lot going on with welfare compliance and the questions over the lawfulness of it. We do have an event coming up that Jay might chuck the link to in the chat now in about 3 weeks, where we'll be running through some of those issues. And part of that is like a community information gathering exercise, uncovering what's going on in the system by getting our personal records and looking through at all of the unethical and unlawful behaviour. So Jay's just popped the link to that online event in the chat, and in the email that we send out tomorrow, we'll include the link that will enable you to grab that template for requesting your own records. And then it also includes an email address for us that you can CC, so that then we can help you deal with the Freedom of Information Request team at Services Australia and DUA and other departments. And so I will also chuck a link to our link tree in the chat right now, so that you can have a look at what else is there from the Anti-Poverty Centre. But Jay, I know you had 5 minutes to wrap up and you have 1 minute, so sorry, I'll stop talking.
We'll
Yes.
head back to Jay to wrap up. But I'll also say that while Labor will win on the numbers, they're also under a lot of pressure in a lot of the seats that your country tells me that you are on. And so make Labor uncomfortable. It's one of the best ways to get what you need. Just make them uncomfortable and do everything you can in your seat to generate community support, to get people angry at your Labor MP.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. And thank you, Chels, Maiy, Kristin, Isabelle, for your contributions tonight. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. I know, sometimes it is a bit overwhelming to come to a thing when at the end of the day, but we really appreciate you coming along tonight. It means a lot. So just stay in touch, look out for that email, and hopefully see you all soon. Have a lovely night.